So I wanted to kind of have this little mini lecture to kind of talk about open source software, because some of you may be looking at these mini courses as a maybe you're joined an organization. This might be your first time getting involved in open source software. Some of you may have experience already in open source software. We kind of want to level the field and have this conversation about the infrastructure that open source software projects need to support the development and the users. And so, as you think about open source software, and I mentioned I've been part of open source software for a long time, I've seen some things work well and some things that kind of don't work well. And so kind of the things that work well, the first thing you kind of need to remember is that communication does not happen in a vacuum, right? I think everyone ever has said that somewhere on the line. Communication does not happen in a vacuum. And the key part around developing open source software is communication. People need to be able to talk about the software. They need to talk about the development that they're doing. They need to talk about the bugs that they're finding and the features that they want to add. Every kind of communication needs to happen. And so that's, I think, sort of the core behind the infrastructure that you need to support open source software. If you're going to look at supporting an open source software project, if your organization is involved in open source software, if you're leveraging maybe open source software, you're using it in one of your products, communication on both ends is going to be key to make that successful. So the first place I would start, if you have an open source software project, is you need a website, right? I mean, that's 2020, you need to have a website. It doesn't need to be fancy. One thing I see a lot of organizations do is they'll try to create a website and they make it really, really fancy, and they get really overworked on adding all these different website features, and they kind of forget what people need to use the website for, right? You need to make it easy for people to learn what that project is about. If that website makes it hard to figure out what the website's about or what the project is about, they're not going to use it. They need to be able to download your new files and your new releases. You need to make an obvious place to go and find that. You can't make your software better unless people are able to report bugs or even request features. And so you need to make it easy for that to happen. It's okay to have an account that they need to sign up for as long as it's a free account and as long as it's obvious to set up an account. But you need to have some ability for people to report bugs. And by the way, there are different kinds of bugs, as we talked about when I did when I was working with GNOME, or as I work with GNOME on usability testing. There's different types of bugs. There's the very standard bugs where it's about functionality and this feature is broken. I try to do these things with the software and the software doesn't do that. It generates an error with this kind of input. I try to read this kind of file and it breaks, right? Those types of bugs are pretty standard bugs. You talk to any of your developers, and those are probably the kinds of bugs they think about. Feature requests are probably pretty standard things as well. I want to do extra thing with the software. I really wish the server platform would do this. I really wish the application system would do this. I really wish I could click on this icon to make it do these things, right? Standard feature requests. But there's also another one, and that is around usability or accessibility. Those are two different topics, by the way, usability and accessibility. But it's very hard to report a bug on usability. And it's very hard to report a bug on accessibility. Why is that, by the way? Because the first thing that developers are going to respond to is, well, it works for me, and they're going to pass on it. So you may have to consider if your application or your open source project is very visual in nature. So it could be a website or it could be a desktop application. You need to think about ways that you can access that input about accessibility bugs, where somebody who's vision impaired isn't able to use the software very well because it requires a lot of clicking and there's no labeling, or it needs to be usable, so people who aren't able to explore new features of the software. So you need to have a different way to do that. And so there's different ways you can consider doing that. I'd be happy to have that conversation at a later date. But those are, think about the different classes of bugs and the different types of feature requests that your software might be needing to get from your users. You also need to have a community. You can't have a community unless you have a discussion of some kind. And so this could be a mailing list. A lot of older websites or a lot of older projects like the FreeDOS project, we have a website, pretty low volume these days, but so a mailing list works well for us. Other projects might need to have some other kind of discussion forum, so they might actually have a web forum where people can drop in a message. Some other projects are now using Slack, but you need to have some kind of platform for your developers and your users to talk about the software. It's not just bug reporting, but they need to be able to talk about the things that they're doing. And by the way, by following that discussion, you're going to learn more about how your users are actually using your open source software. You need to make it easier for people to get documentation. If I try to access your website and I can't figure out how to use it by downloading the software and just trying it, I need documentation. I need somewhere that actually gives me like a quick how-to. Here's how to get it working. Not looking for a book, not looking for links to books, not looking for documentation as book length, but a quick how-to that says here's how to get the software up and running. Here's how to use it and do something useful with it. Those types of things. Maybe you're also, by the way, going to write articles for other websites about your software. Link to those, right? Those are different types of documentation. People also need to understand what's going on with the software. So is the software being updated? So if you went to a website and you couldn't find any information or any links about what's new, what's happening, and the last thing that you can find on the website, maybe on the front page, is something dated from 2 years ago, how up to date is that software? You're probably going to be asking yourself, is anybody using the software? They're asking the same thing of you. If you've got a website that doesn't have any news items on it, that just says, hey, here's a release, and that release happened sometime early 2020, and there's no news that talks about other stuff that's going on, is it really going to be active? Are people going to be using it? So make sure people can find very easily the things that's new, and then also make it easy to follow you on social media. It turns out that, yeah, people do want to follow open source software projects on social media. So if you have a very active social media account, that's definitely something you should do. So again, you don't have to have a very fancy website. You don't have to have lots of colors and lots of features and JavaScript and slide-ins and pop-outs and modular, forms and things like that. Just a static web page that talks about the name of the project, talks about, has links for downloading and bugs and discussions and wikis, has a simple description of what it does, and then has a news list. That's enough for most projects. I would also include in there some screenshots, especially if it's a very visual application. Even on the FreeDOS website, which is DOS, we have screenshots, and you can see screenshots. You can see several screenshots about what FreeDOS actually is, so that way you're not surprised the first time you use it. But most importantly, it's not open source software if people cannot see the code. They need to be able to see the code to be able to work with it. So how are people being able to interact with the code? Are new developers able to make commits to the code? Can they submit patches? And so there's different platforms that you can use. GitHub and GitLab are probably two of the most popular platforms right now for open source software development. Makes it very easy to do a pull request, to copy someone's code, to make a clone of that code, and even just to browse it if you just kind of want to see what's involved. And so very easy to access that code. You're also, SourceForge is an older one, but you are still finding people are using SourceForge. In fact, FreeDOS project is using a lot of SourceForge services right now, but also Mercury and some other things that are out there. So you'll want to have something out there that people can use and follow to see where things are in the code, and most importantly, be able to contribute back to that source code. So, but the key here is it's not open source if I can't see that code. Now, I mentioned before, you also need to be able to track bugs and make feature requests. So it's one thing to release the code. And you've seen a lot of organizations, particularly about 10 years ago, that would release their source code and it's like, that's it, we're done. Or they at least wouldn't make it in any way obvious as to how to access, how to report bugs. So if you can make it easy for your users to track bugs and open feature requests, your software will grow. FreeDOS started in 1994. Here it is 2020, and we're still doing work. People are able to report bugs. They're able to talk about feature requests, and people are able to fix those bugs and add those new features. And so, it's slower with FreeDOS because it's DOS, but that is what keeps the community alive. That is what keeps the community going, is being able to fix those bugs and respond to feature requests. Lots of different ways you could do that. Mozilla is another popular place, or sorry, Bugzilla is another popular place that people can use to track bugs. There's also, you'll find bug tracking in a lot of the codes platforms as well. SourceForge and GitHub, GitLab, they all have some features of bug tracking, but there has to be some way to track those bugs and those feature requests, so that way people can respond to them. And I mentioned before, it's very important for developers to be able to communicate, and developers need to coordinate. They can't talk about the projects that they're working on, and I've seen this bug in the bug tracker, and maybe the discussion is not going to happen just in the bug tracker, but they're going to talk about it in some sort of a forum. Maybe somebody puts in a feature request, and you want to talk about that in a developer community, and not just in the bug tracker, but you want to have a sort of broader discussion about how that might connect with some other things. And so people need to have a way to communicate, or they're not going to be able to coordinate. If they can't talk to each other, the discussion is going to go nowhere. So there's lots of different ways you can do that. As I mentioned, some projects, especially the older projects, have some sort of a mailing list. As I said, some projects also have Slack or some similar type of forum. Even Google Groups is being used by some open source software projects. And whatever you need to do, so that way people can join a discussion and chat with each other, that is what you need to have. I would say these days in 2020, IRC is being used by some open source software projects. I'm not seeing it being used by new developers. And so if you are setting up a new project right now, a new open source software project, or releasing your code, and you're thinking about ways to communicate, I don't know that I would go to IRC. I would probably go to Slack or a mailing list or some other type of active forum, so that way people can drop in a message and come back later and check out responses. Kind of think Reddit in terms of keeping the discussion going. And then you need to make it easy for new people to contribute. How can I join your project and make my first contribution? And that's one of the kind of blind spots of a lot of projects is, it's one thing to say, well, we've got a bug list out there. We've got a feature list out there, feature request list. But when new developers show up in a project, one of the first questions they're going to ask is, what can I do to help? And so it's a good idea somewhere to have a list of things that that new developers might do to get sort of involved in the project. We even have that, by the way, in the FreeDOS project. We have a list of ways that you can contribute. Here on the left, you can see a screenshot from the GNOME website, where they have different things that newcomers could do. If you want to get involved in GNOME, there's a newcomer's guide. It tells you some things you might do with the project. There's documentation is always, by the way, an easy thing to do as part of a project. I guarantee every open source software project out there is looking for help with their documentation. You can see they're also talking about translations. So how do we translate the GNOME messages so that way they can be understood by people who don't speak English as their native language? And so GNOME is available in various dozens of spoken languages. And so they've got lots of different ways for people to come to the GNOME project and immediately find something that could interest them. On the right, you can see a screenshot from the GNOME or the GNU website, where again, they have different lists of things that you could do if you wanted to get involved in the GNU operating system. The FreeDOS website, on my own website, we have a list that's divided into skill levels. And so if you are a new developer, you haven't done much developing at all, then here are some things that might interest you. If you've done more development, you're semi-skilled, sort of medium, moderate, then here's some other things that you might tackle. If you're an expert especially in DOS programming, here's some other projects that you might do that we kind of could need doing. So, we try to address skill levels as well. And so if you can do that in your suggestions for people, I would recommend doing that as well. And as I say, the key to all of this is open. The key to open source software is you need to make it open, and that means people need to be free to join your project. It needs to be easy to join your project, and people need to see what's going on and be able to contribute to that source code and bring back suggestions for improvements, or even best case scenario fixes for bugs and actual code to bring in new features.